I'm Emilee Robbins, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the History Department at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro.
And I'm Andrew Turner. I'm also a second-year PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro.
And today we are interviewing Dr. Greg O'Brien. And just a little bit about Dr. O'Brien. He earned his MA at James Madison University and his PhD at the University of Kentucky.
And some of Dr. O'Brien's research interests include ethnohistory, American Indians of the Southeast, American environmental history, and the American Revolutionary era.
And a few of his book publications include The Native South, New Histories and Enduring Legacies, and Choctaws in a Revolutionary Age, 1750 to 1830. And to start our interview, we just wanted to ask you what initially drew you to study history?
Well, that's an interesting question, which as time has gone on, that answer has changed somewhat. But as I've thought about it, first of all, when I went to college, I went to Randolph-Macon College for undergraduate, which is a small liberal arts college, about 1,400 students in Virginia. And if they had an archaeology/anthropology program, that's probably what I would have done. I then briefly, for about half a year, considered majoring in chemistry. You can believe that. Found it very, very interesting. The drawback to majoring in chemistry, no matter where you major in it, is that then fills up your entire curriculum for your entire undergraduate career. You have no chance to do really any electives, and I had a lot of other interests. So history, like the way we teach it here at UNCG, requires fewer credit hours. So that's why I gravitated towards history. I already knew I loved it, wanted to learn more. But, I think every student makes that decision about, well, do I go with what I love or do I go with something that I think is more career-oriented? And I settled for what I love. So.
That's always good to hear. I think we've had similar experiences. Do you remember an event or maybe an experience or even a book you read as a child that as a younger person that sort of sparked an interest in history for you? Right.
Yeah. So related to the broader question of why I'm interested in history, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, where my mother still lives, and that's actually the reason I did not go to UVA, because I wanted to get somewhere out of town once I graduated high school. But so I grew up, around Monticello, everything Thomas Jefferson, and even though Virginia was a very Civil War intensive state when it came to history, it also is intensive in colonial and Revolutionary era history, and I really gravitated towards the earlier era, the colonial and Revolutionary era. So that just interested me, just both because from even elementary school onward, field trips went to sites like that, right? Because that's what was nearby, and a lot of extra readings and projects we did in school all the way through, had to do with kind of local history, which was also nationally important. Right. So that made it really exciting. And none of that answers why I'm interested in American Indian history, though. And that stems more from growing up. My family owned a farm in Virginia along the James River. And, we'd always find, arrowheads and that sort of thing. And it always got me, which, of course, I thought was the most awesome thing ever when I was a kid. And but as I got older, it led me to think and realize that people had lived in that same area of land for thousands of years, and we didn't know much, or at least I didn't know much about them. And I thought, therefore my curiosity was really piqued, and my interest became, who were these people? Who are they now? If they have descendants still alive, where are they now? And what is that history? And so that's kind of the major background into my interest in American Indian history comes from just seeing their ancestors, physical remains everywhere.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a common theme that we see a lot too. But at a young age, seeing the physical remains, material culture really hooks people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah.
And I guess you've kind of talked about how in undergrad you were guided towards studying history.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you settle on kind of where you ended up going for your MA? Was there someone and for your PhD, was there someone who you specifically wanted to work under?
So this, most graduate students are shocked when I tell them this, but worked for 4 years from getting my BA before going to graduate school, and for all things, I was a banker.
Wow.
Yeah, with a history degree. See, historians can do anything. No special math background and no special math knowledge, but that's not really needed when everything's on a computer, even back in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. So I eventually reached a point 2 or 3 years out of school where intellectually it was just working for a bank was just so dull. So I mean, there was money to be made, yeah, but it's the same thing every day. There's not much creativity, it reached a point where I said, well, I think I want to try graduate school in history, but I really had no understanding of how to go about it or anything like that. So I talked to my undergrad advisor, who of course was still at Randolph-Macon, and he had the good advice that, if this is something you want to try, you don't want to reach a point in life where it's too late for whatever reason. You have too many commitments, you have to make a certain amount of money, you can't take time off. He said, so don't have regrets, try it. And so again, kind of not knowing what I exactly wanted to do, I applied to basically state schools in Virginia, because that's where I was living at the time, and got into a couple and chose JMU just because, kind of like it still is known for, it's a very energetic place, a place that's been growing for a long time. There's a lot of excitement there. There's new faculty all the time, and so, not necessarily history-based reasons for choosing to go there. But once I was there, really for the first time, I realized I could research and write about Native American history, thanks to the faculty who were there. Whereas an undergrad, that wasn't really possible because it was, I went to a small school, small history department. They didn't really have much specialization in American Indian history. They kind of came from a school or from a background that said that's anthropology. But once I got into a master's program, that changed. And then from then on, I earned my master's there, and then I chose my PhD work based on who I would work with, which is my advice to anyone considering doctoral work. Choose a school that has the people you want to work with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, because that's that relationship, that mentor-student relationship is absolutely vital at the doctoral level. It's vital at all levels, but particularly at the doctoral level. So I initially started my doctoral work at the University of Wyoming to work with Colin Calloway, which might be a name you recognize if you know American history, because he's one of those absurdly prolific people who writes a book a year. And then while I was there for a year and a half, and then I transferred to Kentucky, where I'd also been accepted, and accepted at Kentucky to work with Theda Perdue and her husband Mike Green, which would have been great too. But they had several students, and they always had several students, whereas I was Colin Calloway's only PhD student, so that was part of the appeal there. But he got a job at Dartmouth, where he's been ever since, and there was no opportunity to go with him because Dartmouth does not have a PhD program in history. They have a master's program in history only. So then Wyoming also made the decision right after that maybe we don't need a PhD program in history anymore, despite the fact it was pretty thriving and so forth. So the decision was made for me, even though I could have theoretically stayed, been grandfathered in and all that. But with my main advisor also gone, I then transferred to Kentucky in the middle of the year, and Theda Perdue and Mike Green welcomed me with open arms, even put me up in their guest house for a little while.
That's awesome.
Since I transferred in the middle of the year. And so that's how I ended up at Kentucky. And I've always considered it was not financially a very good situation, moving across country, more than once in the midst of PhD work is I don't recommend. But I ended up having, as mentors and as people I could always fall back on for writing me letters of recommendation and advice and that sort of thing. I had Colin Calloway, I had Theda Perdue, I had Mike Green, who's now deceased. But, I had a lot of people in the field I was in who I could depend on and who knew me and knew my work and would promote me and help open some doors and that sort of thing. So in some ways it ended up in an ideal situation, because rather than just having the one advisor, which would have been fine, I'm sure, but now I had like three. So, and Kentucky was a great situation. I was able to get an assistantship pretty quickly, and even though I had transferred in the middle of the year, and they accelerated, they gave me credit for the hours I'd done at Wyoming, so I was finished with coursework at Kentucky in 1 year, and I took my exams 3 weeks after finishing my coursework.
Oh wow!
and then wrote the dissertation in a year, and so actually my whole PhD time frame was 4 years.
Wow!
Even though it was at 2 different schools,
Yeah.
but when those sorts of things happen, to a program and advisors leave and that sort of thing, either you can kind of give up, or you can. For me, I got super motivated to get done.
Yeah.
Before it happened again.
Yeah.
And in fact, Theta, I was, if not the last, one of the very last students that Theta, Purdue, and Mike Green had who finished at Kentucky, because when I graduated, they then that same summer went to Chapel Hill, where they finished their careers.
Yeah. Right. That's right.
Now they could have stayed my advisor if I needed more time, but
Right.
but that was extra motivation to get done.
to get it done.
Yeah. So once you started working on your dissertation at Kentucky, and I guess in your career, are there any primary sources that you found and studied that have become your favorite, or particularly struck you?
Right. Yeah. So this is a neat question, and it made me think back to while I was at Kentucky. As a flagship school in the state, it's still a relatively poor state, but they had a fantastic library. I hope it's still a fantastic library, but I haven't been to it in a while. But they had tremendous microfilm. Then everything was microfilm. We were not yet digitized
Right.
in the 90s. But they had everything, and so there's this fantastic but very quirky manuscript collection called the Draper manuscripts, which is about 100 microfilm reels, and there's a guide to it, which I have here. And I read the guide, and I said, all right, this is a guy who collected all sorts of stuff about kind of late colonial, early national period United States history, particularly in the Midwest, like Kentucky and South, in the South. And so I said, well, I better look at least look at the guide, see if there's anything that mentions, because I was working on a dissertation on Choctaw history, and it mentioned, go to this reel, but it didn't tell you what was in there. And I was like, okay. So I went, and then one of the things I found, and of course this is the reproduction of the original document, but it was a journal kept by one of the American diplomats at the very first treaty meeting between the Choctaws and the United States, which happened in the winter of 1786-87, so shortly after the Revolution. But it was the very first time the Choctaws were meeting with this entity called the United States, because the Choctaws were all the way over in Mississippi.
Right.
And during the war, most Choctaws supported Britain, but not against Americans. It was fighting against the Spanish on the Gulf Coast. The treaty that resulted from that has been published forever. But this was the proceedings. Now, these are American observers, so they're probably missing some things, but they're writing down what all the rituals are the Choctaws are performing, everything the Choctaws say, what their points of emphasis are, how disappointed they are at the end that the Choctaws didn't get what they insisted on. And it just provided an entirely different picture, or really a new picture, because no one else had ever noticed that there was a written description of the several days of treaty negotiation.
Right.
So it's not. It's sort of an obscure thing, but it's also a known primary source manuscript collection that has a published guide and so forth. But nobody had noticed it before. So that turned into, kind of that whole discussion of that first treaty really turned into one of the chapters of my dissertation, but which I then also converted into an article, which was published by the Journal of Southern History, and then won an award for it. So it became pretty prominent. And as all that was going on, and I also made it to the Library of Congress to do research, I realized they also had a slightly different, but basically the same description. But again, in any cataloging, it was not described as proceedings of the treaty between the Choctaws and the United States. It just said miscellaneous Indian documents in this one collection. Yeah. But but it does mention the Choctaws. So I said, okay, I'll see what it is. And so got lucky there. So it actually exists in two places, but where librarians and archivists are so crucial to what we do is, how things are described in a catalog really makes a difference. And so my lesson for that for students or anybody else doing history research is, if it just mentions something that might relate to your work, take a look at it if you can, because you don't know what it might actually be until you look at it.
Yeah.
So
And we got a very similar advice from Dr. Bender about finding things that you're not expecting to find in the archive, and then it being very fruitful. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's always really good advice, as we both kind of are almost at the start of that part of our kind of graduate school career.
Yeah.
But you mentioned how this research ended up in a publication that was award-winning, and that kind of brings us to one of our questions, which is, which publication or conference presentation would you say you are most proud of?
So several years ago, I probably would have said that article, but since then, one of the books you mentioned in the introduction is an edited collection called The Native South, New Histories and Legacies and that sort of thing. And it's really all of the PhD students that Theda Purdue and Mike Green had who worked on Native history, all were part of this essay collection. And it was all new contributions from them, so these are not republished essays. And the first chapter is an interview I was able to do with both of them before Mike Green passed away. So.
Oh, that must have been really special.
Yeah. Oh, it is, and it's really neat. His sense of humor definitely comes through, and I know it's meant a lot to Theda Purdue and to the other contributors, all of us who were her students. So, so I think that's the one I'm most proud of at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. So, you've arrived here at UNCG, obviously. What are some of the courses that you teach here at the university?
Well, I created 3 courses, some of which are taught by my PhD students, but that I've also taught on American Indian history, and also created a survey kind of level course on U.S. environmental history. But I've taught at the 200 level, we have kind of a topics course in world history. I've taught that as world environmental history before. And I've taught the whole range of early American history classes and so forth, and lots of graduate seminars. But I'd say, my favorite course is the 300 level course I designed that is called American Indians and Nature, and it combines American Indian history and environmental history, and it starts, of course, a few weeks before Europeans arrived. That's really not the main part of the story. It's about how American Indian people utilize the environment, and of course that varies depending on where we are or when we are. And then bringing it all the way up to the current day, and showing the changes that happen for colonialism, warfare, disease, and then moving into industrial development, capitalism basically, and the impacts that's had. But Native people still retain significant amounts of land in the United States, and still are deeply engaged, in some ways more deeply engaged with environmental issues now than would have been the case, say, several decades ago. And they constantly make reference back today to it's our history that informs us about this, and our knowledge of how we know how we used to interact with the land, and we want that opportunity again, which will be healing not only for us, give more sovereignty, more control over our own affairs, but also healing to the environment.
Yeah.
And so they draw those connections, and so it's easy in the course to show those connections. So in some ways, that's my most satisfying course. I personally like teaching, period. So I like all my courses, but that's the most satisfying because I can tell a lot of students, it's information they had never heard of before, and then when they see how it's still being played out in a variety of ways today, it's pretty powerful. So.
Very cool.
Are there any kind of tips or advice that you would give either grad students that are just starting off their teaching careers, or people who are just teaching in any capacity? Yeah.
Number one, ask people who have done it before how they did it. Now they and ask them what didn't work or what really did work. You start to build up your own, I don't know, I'd call it kind of a cabinet of activities and projects and that sort of thing, which you can try, and because everyone does things a little differently in terms of how they approach teaching history, and I think we all also adapt. I know my teaching has changed, partly due to technology, but also just being more comfortable in a classroom, but that takes time. The only way
Right.
you get more comfortable is to do it, right?
Yeah.
So, but definitely reach out to people, either students who've already taught or faculty. Get some advice. Never be afraid to ask if there's any issue, even during the semester, with a student, or with, hey, this assignment doesn't seem to be working. How can I save this or something? Because that happens.
Yeah.
That's just part of the nature of teaching and learning how to teach. In addition, like on this campus, we also have a teaching, learning, and resource center,
Yeah.
which helps with everything from how to use Canvas in a variety of ways to pedagogical strategies.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. But otherwise, it's, also when you're a TA, you're going to TA for different people, all of whom probably teach very differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Different styles, different types of activities, different ways of sharing knowledge and making students show that they understand that knowledge and that sort of thing. So absorb all that in. Watch what works, what doesn't. That sort of thing. And hopefully it all works. Everything you see works, but maybe something excites you more because you'd like to try that.
Yeah.
But yeah. So be observant, but then also reach out to people. Never feel like you're on your own. We have a whole department of faculty who we all teach history, as well as many students who have already been doing it. So there's lots of people you can draw on, and none of us have perfect knowledge about teaching. Teaching is always an evolving thing, or it should be, I think. or and I think some of the stereotype of the humanities often has that in mind, that people are walking in with the same notes they've used for 30 years. That doesn't happen in reality.
Right.
Yeah.
It's always evolving, and technology, as I mentioned, plays a role as well. Being able to utilize technology to share information and showcase various sorts of activities that would be really hard or impossible to do otherwise without technology.
So we've gone over, basically a lot of your academic and professional life. So what are some of your interests outside of history?
Pre-COVID, I think we should phrase it that way. Getting outside as much as possible, hiking particularly, but even camping, fishing. That's where these are all things I grew up doing. I even grew up hunting. I don't do that anymore though. So just being outdoors,
Right.
and our home, which is near Jamestown, is a very small yard, but I converted the south-facing side of the house and that part of the yard, the side yard, to a kind of a miniature butterfly garden. So,
very cool.
Oh yeah, so I grow all sorts of perennial plants in there that come back every year, and the first few years, every year until this last summer, I always had monarch butterflies, but last summer there were none. But I'm thinking and hoping that was more because they kind of change their migratory cycles and that sort of thing sometimes, that hopefully it's not that they literally all wiped out. And I know they're not all wiped out, but there's plenty of other native butterflies too that don't migrate, that are there as well. So I do that. That's kind of for fun.
Very
That's
cool.
a little bit therapeutic. And I'm actually kind of weird. I love to do yard work, mainly because I like being outside. That's number one. But you also, it's one of those, unlike a lot of academic work, you see the results of your work immediately.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
And there's a certain satisfaction in that.
That's very true.
Yeah.
But also, as many of you probably know, I'm also a craft beer and Belgian beer fan.
Yeah.
So I have some groups of people who I've gotten to know. A lot of them educators, coincidentally or ironically, through that, who are really into craft beers, and North Carolina is one of the best states for that. So when I moved here in 2008, I was astounded then, and of course it's probably doubled the number of breweries in the state now, since then. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's myself, sometimes by myself, but also with some friends, we schedule, like, all right, let's go to this state park, do all hiking and everything all morning, everything, and also then we're going to check out this brewery that we've never been to that's right down the road, things like that. So the two often get combined these days. So.
Yeah,
Very cool. That's awesome.
Fun. Is there any kind of craft beer that you would say is the most interesting? Like,
if you mean styles, yeah, most any kind of traditional Belgian styles like saisons, doubles, triples, Belgian ales are probably my favorite, and it has a lot to do with the yeast that they use. I'm not a huge IPA fan.
Okay, gotcha.
Particularly the kind of original West Coast style, real piney, hoppy IPAs. The hazier New England style ones, some of them are fine, but that's not my go-to. And actually, I've gotten much more into stouts than I used to be. I used to be like, wow, I can waste time drinking this. It's just too bitter or too thick or something. But now, particularly in the winter, they're really good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I was just curious. And I know this hopefully will be applicable soon. But we've been asking people, if you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you be?
In the world. So
yeah.
I've never been, but it is somewhere on my bucket list to spend probably as much time as possible at once, like probably a couple weeks in Ireland. Perhaps for obvious reasons, but not only beer, but ancestry and that sort of thing. But
right.
But I also have some family roots in New Mexico, and I love northern New Mexico with a passion. I haven't been there for a few years, so that's high on my list. But really, being in any mountains, even here in North Carolina, and just hiking and stuff, that would be nice, as opposed to chained to a desk. So
Yeah.
Maybe in a few weeks.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Couple more weeks. Yep. And I would say, thinking back also, since I just mentioned ancestry, I have a very diverse European ancestry, and it's I come from a family that was always interested in genealogy, so that's probably a history, some origin of my history interest as well, and it's something I've kept up, so that I have very distant relatives who all contact me when there's a genealogy question and things like that. So that's pretty cool. I like doing that. It's kind of, at least within my extended family, putting my historical skills to use for them as well. So,
well, I guess to wrap things up, we just wanted to see if you had any advice for someone who is contemplating getting into academia or getting a PhD.
Right. Well, it has to be said, you can't come in with rose-tinted glasses. You have to be realistic about what the academic job market is, which is pretty much shit, to be honest. But saying that, one of the things I'm really proud of with our doctoral program is that we put a large emphasis on teaching, helping you all learn how to teach, making sure you actually do teaching, but with mentors and that sort of thing. And I think that where we've had a high percentage of our graduates have gotten tenure track and college university jobs, and I think that's the primary reason why. I mean, many of them are doing fantastic research and published books. I'm not slighting that, but the fact that they could walk out the door and teach a class immediately with no problem because they've done it before, I think has been very helpful. So I also think there's nothing wrong with getting a PhD, even if your career goes other directions, or not strictly academic, but maybe something else, history adjacent, because a PhD is an accomplishment. And, I come, both sides of my family, had many generations of undergrad degrees, but no one had ever had a PhD before. So that was pretty cool. It's not the same at all, not even close to being a first generation college student, but it's a point of pride, and it means things to people around you more, and you. So
that's great advice. Yeah.
So just know that the job market is tough, and so making a niche for yourself, doing all the extra things, trying to publish what you can, particularly articles if you can while you're still a graduate student, of course participating in conferences, writing book reviews on occasion for journals, anything you can do to add lines to your CV while you're still a student, will all help. But I really think that teaching is what moves a lot of our students further up in the line in terms of being competitive for jobs. So
Very
Makes
cool.
a lot of sense.
It does, definitely.
And particularly, I think even this is true before COVID, but I think it's even more true now that schools who are hiring, they can't afford to have people come in who don't know how to teach yet, right?
Right.
They're kind of like we're becoming in terms of the university's budget, really lean departments, and they need people that can contribute right away.
Mm-hmm.
And so that teaching experience is very crucial. So
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much
Yes,
for
thank
joining
you
us
very
this
much.
afternoon.
Sure. That went very quickly.
Yeah, I know. We had a wonderful time just getting to know you more, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank
you
you.
so much.
You too.